All right, what's up, Dragon Brood? So y'all seem like y'all really want more of these strategy videos, and people seem to be struggling with deck building, so I'm going to start there and make it easy for you to deck build. Now, I am going to give you a fair warning. There's a little bit of math involved here, and I did make some simple spreadsheets to explain some things, so it won't be that complicated. I made it as simple as possible for you. But I will let you know that there are a lot of other videos on more. Matter of fact, I have a reusable notebook here that I have like, I don't know, one, two, three, four, five, six, like seven other videos already planned out. So if y'all like this one and y'all do all the things like subscribe, share, leave comments, do all the things so YouTube knows you like this type of video, we will have more for you. But today, what we want to do is break down what each type of deck needs and looks like as far as lands, creatures, non-creature spells, and then the average mana cost in the decks, and then the amount of land that, if you wanted to start from the beginning, what these decks might look like, so you know what you're aiming for if you're trying to build each of the major types of decks, that being aggro, mid-range, and control. At the end of the video, we're going to also have a template that shortcuts everything, but on the way there, we're going to break down how we got to the numbers of each of those. So grab a drink and let's get to it. Yeah, and again, I want to say I appreciate all of you for taking the time to watch this video and go through all this, because what I realize is it's very easy for people to want to just watch videos about decks and go, oh, I just want to play that. But if you really want to understand how decks are, sometimes you have to break them down to understand what you need to be making. So we're going to start there. So let's talk about aggro decks, and we're going to go through all the different decks and also show how they can be different within each deck type. So here I set up a chart and spreadsheet, really, to show some of the major aggro creature decks and show the commonalities and the differences between them, so you can understand what each one needs and why. So here you see we have, at the first line, Boros burn decks, right? They have 21 land, generally 20 creatures, 19 non-creatures. Now, I base each of these deck types on the most popular versions of the decks and which ones were performing well based on results on major websites. So this took a little bit. But the average mana value of these decks is only 1.69. So this means they have a ton of 1 mana things, but even those decks are still playing 21 lands. And people might be saying, why? It's like, well, because of the style of the deck, right? They want to be playing a creature and burning something out of the way so their efficient creatures can punch through, right? So while they do have very few actual creatures they need to be casting, they're trying to play multiple things in a turn still. So everything needs to be very cheap so they can cram everything in there with fewer lands, taking up spots that don't actually deal damage. Now, similar to that, you do have mono red aggro decks that play the same number of lands, same number of creatures, same number of non-creatures, but the mana value is just a touch higher at 1.74. Basically the same. I mean, it's a rounding error at that point, depending on what cards you decide to include. So nothing really different than those. But this is where you get a little bit of an anomaly here. The mono white life gain decks, they play one less land on average, generally 20, with 30 creatures, so you're talking about 10 more creatures, but 9 to 10 fewer non-creature spells. And their average casting cost is a full 2, actually over 2. And this might have you saying, well, okay, if their casting cost is higher, well, how are they able to play less lands? Well, if you notice, I left a note here that says it's been adjusted to 1.65 if you don't include the ley lines. Because the ley lines, most of the time when they play them, are free. So while you're deck building, you can't really count those as part of your cost because you're kind of hoping to never cast those. In a lot of cases, if the white deck is actually physically casting those, it's not generally the best situation for them. Every once in a while, sure, but it's not part of their game plan. So you're hoping those are just free. So if you cut those out of the cost, it actually comes down below the other decks at 1.65 and being similar to what the other decks want to play. So one less land isn't that weird, and it's right in line. The other benefit I would say that the white deck has is the creatures kind of are the spells, right? Everything that's gaining life is adding counters to stuff, letting you draw cards, right? Doing these other things. So you don't need as many spells. You need to maximize your creatures because your creatures are what enabling everything else to happen. So while this may still be an aggro deck, and it's similar in build to the other burn decks, the mono red decks, the white decks actually don't want that many spells. They want more creatures. So these are all aggro decks. They just look a little bit different. Now, when we start talking about the mono green landfall decks, this gets even more strange, right? Because now you have another aggro deck that's playing 23 lands and 25 creatures, so between the other types of decks we've seen, and only 12 non-creature spells, but their average spell cost has gone up to 2.37. This kind of accounts for those extra 3 lands because you're going to need to cast stuff more consistently. And a lot of times this is because you have a lot of 3 mana things. Usually like the Hydra, the 3/2 Chocobo, and depending on the version, sometimes you're playing the, what's that guy? The 2/4 one that when you play a landfall deck, you mill a card, that whole thing, right? And you can play multiple lands a turn. However, the landfall deck also just needs to play more land because you need to be able to fetch out lands, right? You need to be able to do the landfall thing. So again, even that deck built differently. But I think you're starting to see the picture here, right? You have just these various decks in this deck category that there's not one set way to build. I think it's very easy to get caught up in, oh, this is exactly how a deck needs to be built. It's like, well, sort of, right? You still need to take considerations for what your deck is trying to do. Because again, even looking at the mono black sacrifice deck, this is another one where 22 land, 30 creatures, 10 non-creatures, but it has a very low mana value, right, at 1.68. The reason being, though, is this needs more creatures because part of the benefit of the deck is sacrificing its creatures for various value, right? So it wants to have more bodies out and get stuff out of the graveyard and do all this. So it kind of just makes sense. It's really just depends on the deck. So this is what makes it hard. Why it's easy to say, oh, I wish I had a template to just build the things, but sometimes the card choices or the individual deck itself, even within that deck category, changes things. But anyway, wrapping all that up, we're looking at an average of 21.67, so we'll call it 22 lands, 25.67, so anywhere between creatures, as we've seen in the decks, anyway, we would say from 23 to 28, and then also your non-creature spells, 12 to 18. And if you're building an aggro deck, you probably want to keep your average mana value around 2. That's what we've seen with all these decks. Some are slightly higher, some are slightly lower. But if you average it out, you're going to be rounded up, rounded down. You're going to be in that ballpark of 2. If you start creeping to where your average mana value is more than 2, you're probably moving into the range of being a mid-range deck more than you're being an aggro deck. Because you just need that low cost to be able to outrun your opponents, to be able to play multiple spells a turn. So if you want to build an aggro deck, generally starting in this ballpark is going to be a good way to go. The 22 lands, 23 to 28 spells, 12 to 18 non-creature spells, and then the low average mana value of 2. All right, let's move on to do the mid-range decks since I mentioned those there. Now, mid-range decks get even more strange for what falls into this category because we're going to see a lot of numbers here we're going to talk about that make each of these decks very drastically different. So this is even harder to figure out than just the aggro decks because what your deck's trying to do drastically changes the needs of the deck. So, starting with one of the most popular ones right now at the top of the chart here, we have the Sultai Reanimator deck, right? With 23 lands, generally 30 creatures, 7 non-creature spells. But the average mana value is 4.27. This is one of the higher ones that we'll see. However, I had to go back and adjust that number to 3.51. The reason being is there's a lot of creatures in the deck that, one, you're not even really trying to cast, right? You're wanting to play them out of the graveyard. That's the first thing. But then you also have stuff like your Overlord of the Baelmark, I believe is the black one, where you're not really hoping to cast it for 5 mana. You're hoping to play it earlier for 2 mana. So what I had to do, what I realized when I was building this graph out, this chart, was that I had to go back and look at some of the decks and see, okay, how often are you likely to play a card in a certain way? And then I had to do that to justify the numbers and make it make sense for the mana. Now, again, later in the game, turn 5, yes, sometimes you just cast the Overlord and it's not a big deal. But generally, that's not what this deck's trying to do, right? You're trying to play the stuff out of the graveyard, play your bigger cards cheap. So with that, you're looking at a 3.51 adjusted mana value. I know, boring math, but it does make the deck work. But this also plays a lot of creatures because the creatures are the whole impetus for the deck. Again, Overlord of the Belmark is putting stuff into the graveyard, right? The 2/2 flyer that you draw 2, discard 2, it's putting stuff in the graveyard, helping you draw cards, right? It has a bunch of stuff like that. So your creatures are your spells in a lot of ways. But if you look conversely to that, we have the mono black midrange deck, right? This is generally going to be something that falls in the neighborhood of being like the Demon's deck or something like that. This plays 24 lands, so roughly the same number. Plays 16 creatures, so way less than you're seeing of the other deck, but it plays a lot more spells, and 20 of those. Right now, 2.55 is the average cost of the deck. However, I did count Chamber, the land, or the room, as a 5 mana value spell, right? Just because of the way things work. Because you will generally be paying the mana to unlock that. But it also gets away with playing fewer creatures because technically it's at least 20 creatures because a lot of them play 4 copies of the chamber, right? Ritual chamber. So you're actually getting that room to make a 6/6 demon. So you're kind of cheating a little bit on what needs to be a non-creature spell and what needs to be a creature spell. And these decks tend to play a lot of efficient removal. You know, you're playing creatures that are hard to deal with, like the Stalker that has Death Touch and can, lose half your life. So there's a lot of little things going into the decision of why you need more spells than you need creatures. But it still falls squarely in the mid-range category because that deck will still be trying to kill you with its creatures, just generally, 3 mana and 4 mana creatures, more than it's trying to kill you with 1 and 2 mana creatures. Another example here that kind of breaks the mold is going back to the aggro decks where they were playing 21, 22 land. Well, so did the Orzhov Sephiroth decks. And they're playing 34 creatures. And you're like, okay, well, 4 non-creature spells and a fairly low average mana value of 2.23. And you're probably wondering then, okay, if it fits all these numbers, why did I put this in the category of a mid-range deck? Well, because it doesn't really try to attack and beat you down. Now, can it? Sure, every once in a while if you get a slow draw and it gets a fast creature draw. But that's not generally how it tries to win. It tries to play the long game of draining your life total, using Raise the Past to get things out of the graveyard back on the battlefield, sacrificing stuff to its 3/2 creature, surveilling with the hounds, like doing all this stuff, right? So it's not trying to win on turn 4. It's going to beat you most of the time on turn 6, 7, 8, whatever, after it's had time to fill up its graveyard and do all that stuff. So it's squarely a mid-range deck. The numbers just look different, right? And again, this is one of those things that might seem obvious to some people, but I'm using this to show you how different decks can look within a certain category. I mean, we've already seen decks that play 22, 23, 24 land, right? We've seen decks that play 16, 30, and 34 creatures. And then also, non-creature spells of 4, 7, and 20, right? So they are vastly different depending on what your deck's trying to do. Now, I will say the others look a little normal when you look as far as 24 lands, 24 creatures, 12 non-creatures, 24, 23, 13, 25, 20, 15, right? These all kind of fall within the average, except for the Temur Battlecrier deck. Then you're back to 22 lands, 30 creatures, 8 non-creatures. But this one gets a little bit of a pass because while it is a creature deck, it's a pseudo combo-y deck. It's again, it's another deck where the creatures are the spells, right? Temur Battlecrier reducing the cost of stuff. The 4/2 creatures that's letting you draw cards, right? When you play something 4 or greater. You're playing the 4/6 blue creature, right? You warp it for 2, you get to draw cards, right? All your creatures are the spells. So in that case, you're kind of just playing more creatures because they all come with abilities that function like spells, even if you don't want the creatures on the battlefield for a long period of time. But with that, you have the 3.13 average mana value for the Battlecrier deck. But again, I adjusted it down because you have some creatures that you're really trying to warp into play more than actually cast them. So that's kind of a whole thing. The one outlier here I would say that really stands out is the Selesnya Yuna deck at 4.33. But again, had to do a little bit of adjustment down to a 3.83 just because there's a lot of cards in there you're never trying to cast, right? Where you're talking about Knights of the Round, the big 9 mana, the Bahamut, right? You're not trying to cast those. You're just trying to get them out of the graveyard. Like, will you sometimes cast them? Absolutely, right? You just get later in the game, you have a bunch of mana, sure. But generally, you're not trying to cast those. So it's hard to count those directly against the mana value. So you gotta be a little squirrely with the numbers. That brings us to a final template for mid-rangey decks with an average of 24 lands, roughly, 25 creatures, 11 non-creatures, and you're going to want your average mana value to be somewhere between 2.5 and 3. And I guess actually I should take a second here for people. I just assumed that a lot of people know how to figure out their average, but maybe some of you don't. Basically what you do is you take every single non-land card in the deck. So you add up all those mana values, and then you divide them by the total number of cards. So to get to, let's say, the Battle Crier deck number, ignoring the lands, I went through and said, okay, what do all the creature mana values add up to? What do all the non-creature cards mana value add up to? Put all those together and then divide by 38. So I hope that makes sense there, just so you understand where those numbers come from. So when you do that for yourself, you will add up the total mana value of every single card in the deck, then divide by the total number of non-land cards you have. And that'll get you in that ballpark. If you're higher than the 3, you're probably going to be struggling because most decks right now, even if you have a few higher cost cards, you need to be able to play the early part of the game. And you're going to see the same thing when we talk about control decks here in a second. So once your average mana value starts pushing well above 3, you're going to start struggling to be able to cast your cards. Like, that's a whole thing. And we have a whole other set of videos coming for individual like mana that needs to go in monocolor decks, 2-color decks. Like there's, believe me, we have more stuff coming. But for now, if you want to build a mid-range deck, these are the numbers you want to target. Okay, now this brings us to control decks. And I wanted to include these as well because they play a very large number of lands by comparison, but you're going to see why here in a second. But again, control decks can also be built very differently. So we're going to start with the Esper Mill decks. I think most people have seen these. They're the 3-color black, white, blue decks. They're trying to mill all your stuff, kill you that way in the long run, right? They're playing 27 lands. And this makes sense because their main spell that wipes the board and mills you, they need at least 6 mana for. Or is it 7 mana? Either way, it's a lot of mana, right? They need a bunch to be able to cast that. And they want to cast it on time a lot of times. So they need to have more mana. They only play 2 creatures from the versions I could find generally, and it's going to be something like the 4/5 that gains life, makes a couple of tokens, right? Outside of that, they're not playing a whole lot. There's a few versions that'll play something like Meringue River Regent, but they're not playing a lot of creatures. That's not their game plan, which means basically all your slots are dedicated to non-creature spells, right? 31, not a surprise. But even then, again, if you look here in the third column, at the average mana value, you're looking at a 2.96. So again, staying in that 3 range. Most decks are not going to push much higher than 3. That was consistent across all these decks we looked at that do well regularly in standard. So even beyond understanding the number of lands you should play or number of non-lands you should play or whatever, understanding your average mana value is probably the largest indicator. Once you're over 3, you really have to start looking at how the deck's going to function and what you're trying to do. That might be the biggest flaw for a lot of people. And that's something I hadn't really thought about explaining to folks, but it was evidence after building all these different charts. Now, again, for this Esper Mill deck, I did put 3 steps ahead as just 3 mana value because that's how it's going to be cast most often. Yes, sometimes you'll pay the extra 2 so you can draw and discard and do all that with the card. But I tried to figure out what are the most common ways these decks will be played after reviewing some games, and that's how I counted the mana value to make the decks work. Granted, even if I included them as a 5, excuse me, it's very possible this number would have only come up to like a 3.07, maybe a 3.1, wouldn't have changed the number drastically. But then we have 4-color control, right? So now you've got 27 lands, looks very similar, 0 creatures, and everything going into the non-creature slot, which is fair, right? It's not trying to kill you that way. It's trying to kill you with either burn spells, with the big Jeskai deal. It has some of the Mardu spells that can drain you for 3, and sometimes they will play a couple of creature lands in their list as well. So they have other ways to kill you other than milling you or with creatures, so they're trying to kill you with a bunch of other things that are just harder for you to deal with in most cases. Again, 3.06, so again, staying right around that 3. You're not seeing it move very much. And again, made a little bit of an adjustment for Fire Magic and for 3 Steps Ahead, putting them at 3 mana value each, because that's generally how they're used most of the time. Now, Azorius Control was a little more interesting to find the most popular versions. They play 1 less land, not a huge surprise. Those decks also tend to play a little bit more. Actually, all these decks tend to play a fair amount of card searching or looking at your top 3 or 5 or whatever and digging a little bit. But even then, you're trying to hit lands on time. That's the biggest thing, you know. And that's why you hear me say, even sometime in my games, in the early part, is if they stumble on a land drop or two, that can be huge against the control decks, even compared against the aggro and mid-rangey piles. But they do play 12 creatures. And depending on the version, this was a combination of Meringue River Regent, the big 4/5 guy, the flanker, the 3/1 cat. I saw a couple other small things. 22 non-creature spells. Again, total mana value at a 2.9. I believe I adjusted a number down to 2.58, depending on how you view Meringue River Regent. A lot of times being played for the... 2 cards, actually. It was Meringue River Regent, often played for the 4 mana side to draw and discard. And what is that? The big 6/6, you can... It has a adventure attached that you could pay to, and attacking creature goes on the top or bottom of the opponent's library, something like that. So either of those guys, generally being played for their spell more than the creature half, though you will cast them later in the later stages of the game. So I adjusted down for that. But again, you're still talking around 3. And then Jeskai Control looks very similar, but with different win conditions, because they do have spells that are doing a couple extra things to help the decks out. But 26 land, 5 creatures, 29 non-creatures, 3.2. Theirs is a little bit higher because there is that Jeskai 7 mana spell that a lot of them play like a full set of. And generally the creature in this deck is is it Seiko or whatever, the 4/5 that can counter or copy spells out of the graveyard. So those push the value up a little bit, but you're getting a lot out of those cards, so you're kind of okay with it. But even then, it's not way over 3. If we're rounding properly, that's still 3, right? So if you were going to build a control deck that's trying to sweep all the creatures, draw cards, spot removal, you know, maybe win with the Planeswalker, whatever, you're generally going to want 26 or 27 land, no more than 4 to 7 creatures, because again, you're playing board sweepers and everything else. Creatures aren't going to be your main way to victory. And then 25 to 30 non-creature spells, and still keeping your average mana value around 3. So I would bet a lot of you watching right now thought, oh, well, obviously when we get to the control decks, the average mana value is going to be like 5. It's like, no, it's really not. Because if you think about it, they're still playing things like Lightning Helix. They're playing Consult the Star Charts. They're still playing the 3 mana one, right? Look at your top 3, put 1 in your, or top 5, put 1 in your hand, or 2 in your hand, actually. Like things like that are keeping your mana value fairly low, right? That's the whole thing. So while it does play a longer game and want more mana, part of it's because they want to be able to sometimes cast a sorcery that has big value on their turn, but still leave up a counter spell, right? So they need that mana so they can search and cast things on the same turn, things like that. That's how they're going to be able to win their games. So while the aggro decks want to do it so they can keep pressing the issue with their creatures, the control decks need more mana because their spells, generally, while they're not super expensive, tend to be 2 and 3 mana, and that means you got to have 4, 5, 6 mana on the battlefield to do multiple things in a turn. Whereas with the aggro decks, your average spell being 1 or 2 mana means you can get by with 3 or 4 and still function doing multiple things in a turn. But I did promise you that at the end of all this, we would have a finalized template. So here it is. If you just need a shortcut template to build aggro mid-range control decks. Now, each of these can be broken down into what type of lands, what type of creatures, what type of... That's for another video. Don't even bother putting in comments. We're going to talk about that on another day. This is just if you're starting fresh and you've never built a deck or you're struggling to build magic decks. If you want to build a creature-heavy deck, a mid-rangey deck, a control deck, this is where you should be starting from. So, you know, mark this video as a favorite so you can come back to this spot and know what's going on here, or screen cap this so you just have it forever, whatever you need to do. But this is where I would start if I was deck building. I think this is a nice shortcut, a little bit of a cheat code, if you will, to be able to just say, hey, I don't know what this deck really needs to look like, but if you start here, you'll at least be in the relative ballpark of what you want to do. And then you can also look and say, okay, if I'm trying to build a really aggro deck, I want to beat my opponents with a theme creature deck. Okay, I have too many non-creatures in here, right? If you look and say, I've got 20 non-creatures, you're probably not where you want to be, right? Or if you're also looking and say, I only have 20 lands, like, it's probably not enough. You know, we had people say, oh, you just need 20 land. Like, no, there's not very many decks that only play 20 land. There's a handful, but not many. So 22 is probably where you're going to be. But again, mid-rangey decks, same thing, right? If you end up with 30 creatures in your mid-rangey deck, it's probably not it, unless you're an outlier playing something like a reanimator deck and your creatures are also functioning as spells, right? Outside of that, this is probably closer to where you want to be. And then control decks, we talked about just a second ago, kind of take care of themselves at 26 or 27 lands, 4 to 7 creatures tops. And it's arguable, depending on the type of control deck you're playing, there may be no creatures, right? The ones you're playing are generally going to draw you cards, gain you life, make you some number of tokens so you can block the opponent's stuff and buy time, right? If they're not buying you time to get to your other spells, you're probably not playing creatures at all. And then you have the 25 to 30 non-creature spells. Basically, everything that's not a land or your 0 to like 4 creatures is just going to be a non-creature spell. But the biggest thing, I think, as we talked about in this video, and I spelled absolutely wrong here. Oh my God, what am I doing? Average definitely doesn't have that extra. What was I even trying to do here? Oh my God. Okay. Well, average mana value is going to be no more than 3 for any of these decks that you build. I think that is the biggest takeaway here, is when you're looking at your decks, if your average mana value starts to creep to 4 or worse, 4 plus, it's probably going to be too slow. I think that's just the outright secret to a lot of decks. You can get away with maybe 3.5-ish if you have a lot of land searching, mana creatures, stuff like that, so you can still cast things. But outside of that, I don't think it's going to work out for you. And this is consistent across all the different decks that we looked at. All right, y'all, now with all this information, you should at least be able to build decks a little bit faster. And again, I'm working on a couple other things I'll have for you too, so don't forget to like, subscribe so you don't miss those. Hit the notification bell, most importantly. But what I need to know is, was this too much? Was this too much information? Were the numbers too crunchy? Did it get too boring anywhere along the way? I need y'all to let me know so I can make the other videos a little bit better for you. But to all of you for now, happy deck building. We'll see you next time.